get started. So thank you for joining this afternoon for the Bureau Veritas and Due Solutions partner webinar, Better Together, Energy Audits and Software. So before we begin, if you could go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So before we begin, we want to let all attendees know that your phone lines have been muted, but we do encourage you to submit questions throughout. There's a Q&A feature that you can use to submit your questions via the Zoom platform. And we also have the chat feature, but we would highly encourage you to utilize the Q&A feature that you see. We're also going to be reserving 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And if we can't get to all the questions today, we will have someone follow up upon conclusion of the event. Next, this session is being recorded and we will send you a link to the recording as part of our webinar follow-up. And then lastly, throughout the presentation, polling questions will be asked and participation by responding to those questions is highly encouraged. Next up, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. We have Dan Arant, who is a solutions consultant, a solutions consultant manager in energy at Dude Solutions. That was a mouthful, apologies. He joined the Dude in 2013 and is a certified professional energy manager through North Carolina State University, has completed his certified energy manager training with the Association of Energy Engineers. Dan graduated with his BS degree from the University of North Alabama. He and his wife and 3 daughters currently reside in Birmingham, Alabama, where he works alongside Due Solutions' Energy Business Unit. Dan's passionate about empowering the public and private sectors to reduce utility waste in their facilities and operations. Next, I'd like to introduce Matt Munter, who is Principal Executive Vice President of Sales with Bureau Veritas and is responsible for all activities where Bureau Veritas acts as a prime consultant, sub-consultant, or supplier on government and public sector contracts. He customizes BV's services to meet the needs of many government agencies. He's responsible for contract negotiations with vendors and subcontractors that support government operations. He also coordinates the development of products and procedures that meet market needs and comply with applicable standards and regulations, while ensuring the quality of deliverables and conformance with contractual obligations. Finally, I'd like to introduce Kostab Shabakswar, who is an energy and strategy operations consultant with Bureau Veritas, with interests in energy sustainability and development of low carbon economies. He has more than 10 years of experience in delivering energy audits to clients of all sectors and is himself a certified energy manager. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen, and thanks everyone on the call for joining us. Normally I would stand for these things, but just so you know, I'm a human. I've got some nerve pain, so I'm sitting today. So this is a fun test of how this is going to go. But I appreciate you joining us, and we're going to talk about a lot today. I really want to highlight these middle sections 2, 3, and 4. I mean, we're really going to go through everything from if you can go back, we're really going to go through everything from what types of services and audits we might perform. As you know, there's a lot of approaches here. We're going to talk about some sustainability initiatives like net zero, and then I'm actually really excited. Let's talk about the money. Let's talk about some of this stimulus opportunity we've got coming down the pipe. And so, you know, with that in mind, if we go to the next slide, just as an introduction, we titled this Better Together, and I think intentionally, we're really looking at how software and services are playing a role in, you know, not to use a cheesy cliche, but this new normal we find ourselves in, right? I love this very simple statistic. Number one, because it's simple, but number two, because it's actionable. There's waste happening in our buildings. You know, Kristen mentioned I've got 3 girls. Our 3rd daughter was born in March, and you know, right in the height of COVID restrictions and social distancing. And where this became apparent to me is waste is not always intentional in our buildings. In the hospital with our girl, I'm the dad in the room. I feel like my job is really to run back and forth and get food for mom, right? And so I found myself coming back into the hospital lobby, and there's a crowd, maybe 8 or 9 folks around me. What are we doing? We're waiting in line for the elevator. Pre-COVID, we all would have hopped on, taken our trips to the 4th, 5th, 6th floor, got off, done it in one go. With social distancing mandates, that elevator was running, 3 shifts, if you will, to move the same amount of people. And so it really struck me, this is an example of inefficiency, by necessity. And so, I started thinking about that. And as we prepare for this presentation today, next slide is, I really want to kind of reframe, the energy management focus to not really see inefficiency as a problem so much as recognizing the opportunity. And that's what we're going to talk about today when we look at energy auditing services, when we look at how software can play a role. It's just knowing that there's an opportunity to correct some waste in our facilities. So a couple things we hear, and maybe why many of you are here on the call, is some of these things we see on the screen. I know, Dan, there's waste in my building. I don't know where to start, right? I wear 15 hats as it is. And the thought of maybe walking through a facility and even doing something as basic as just keeping a simple audit, I don't have the time, right? I don't know what to prioritize, even if I did have the time to identify opportunities. I'm too busy. Energy is complex, right? You can see these things on the screen, and this is what we want to address today. And so, with that being said, Matt, I think you're gonna talk with us a little bit about some of the options and where to start.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So this is a best practices presentation. So generally, we don't like to do too much of a commercial about who we are. So this is the only commercial you're going to get. It's this is the stuff that we do as far as energy goes. So Costa runs our energy division. He's a certified energy manager, and really we work with clients everything from initial site kind of inspections, starting with just utility bill analysis and benchmarking, and we're helping big industrial clients with greenhouse gas reporting. We've got some European clients, but I think today most of the people on the call are either K-12 schools or state and local government. That's a big part of our practice, and so I think we've got some good stuff to talk to you about there. And this is a little bit about the credentials. At one point, we were one of the top energy benchmarking outfits in the country, and certainly DSI and others that are automating the benchmarking through their software now have big numbers as far as that. But that's one of the big so what's about why have a software model to automate your utility bills. It immediately starts giving you feedback in a very easy to understand method that I think a lot of us are familiar with. If I was in front of you in a class right now, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you'd benchmarked your facilities, and if you hadn't, we would go a little bit deeper into why not, and how easy that is, either by yourself or through an automated system. It gives you immediate feedback on how you match up with other peers in the market, and that should trigger you to, hey, there's some stuff I could be doing. So that was it on that slide, Kostya, and I think you got the next one.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Matt. So as Dan mentioned, right, waste is not intentional. So we often talk about like how should we approach this problem of addressing sustainability and addressing energy efficiency. So over the last 10, 11 years of working on these projects, we came up with a philosophy that more or less jives well with how we think over here. So the first goal that when we talk to our clients is, let's try to understand where you are using most energy. Let's try to optimize those things. Let's try to improve your natural ventilation into the building. Let's try to see what we can tweak so as to bring in efficiency in your operations. Let's try to reduce your carbon footprint through that measures. Followed by that, we'll start looking into, can we put some more controls in it, put some smart logic in it, so that your lighting can turn off as well as your HVAC system can turn off when there is no occupancy in the space, right? Why just turn off the lighting if you can tie in your sensor to your VAV box, it can save you both energy through HVAC as well as through lighting. So making the buildings more smarter. And followed by that is, do we have enough roof space to generate our own solar PV? Can we offset some of the energy use that we are consuming at this building so that we can do a feasibility analysis to say, okay, you know what, we have so much potential through which we can reduce our carbon footprint. And then ultimately, the most important thing is bringing all of this together, right? How do you tie all the first three steps together so that each one is talking to each other? Understanding at what points of time your buildings is consuming the most energy. Are you able to generate energy to offset it? Can you pre-cool your buildings so that, when the tariffs go up in the morning, you are not really tapping into more energy use from the grid? And when you bring all these things together, that's what creates a whole demand reduction plan that we put forward in front of the client. So, we just conducted a quick poll, and most of you are saying that you have an energy saving targets of 10 to 20%. And when I started working here, Matt explained me this thing. When you say the 20% reduction, in one way, you look at it like you're shutting down 20% of your building. So that's how much energy we're trying to reduce. Net zero is a whole altogether a new target, right? We are working with some of our clients for net zero, and we'll be talking more about it. So 20% reduction, net zero, these are big targets. And we are hopeful that as we go through this, we will be able to address some of your concerns. So the next slide I want to talk about is, how do we approach these problems? We strongly believe that everything has three parts: start, middle, and end. So do energy audits or energy management or sustainability initiatives or net zero initiative, whatever you might call it, right? Phase one is understanding where you are. Phase two is exploring how you can identify measures so as to act on it. And phase three is to understand what are the measures we captured, how to prioritize them. So phase one starts with understanding, where do I stand today? What's my bench? What's my greenhouse gas consumption? What's my carbon emissions? So this is done by benchmarking your site. So you may have heard this 100 times, that what's your carbon footprint? Where do you stand? Do you have an understanding of how many utility meters you have? What meters need to be disconnected? What meters are to be kept? What meters can be consolidated? What meters serve multiple buildings? Are you able to understand that of that 1 meter that serves 3 buildings, which building is the worst performing of them, right? A lot of those questions get raised when you're trying to understand where you are at. So quite often, coming up with these questions, we direct our clients to say, Energy Manager as a tool itself can help you over here, where you can start pushing your data into this software and understand that, okay, I have 7 buildings in my portfolio. I have 5 gas meters, but all 7 buildings consume it. So you can attach those gas meters and accounts to each and every building. Understand what is your consumption pattern. Start pushing the data into Energy Manager so that it can track your consumption year over year and understand that, hey, you know what? This is how much my building is consuming year over year, and this is where I stand, right? So I see that there's a question over here. I'm just going to keep moving. Okay. So one of the cool things of Energy Manager is, right, as you can track the information, it can push your information into the portfolio manager side. So most of the folks who are on the call today should be aware of what a portfolio manager is. It allows you to benchmark it and understand where your building stands in comparison to similar buildings in a similar settings, right? And ultimately, this is kind of a GPA score you get, right? How did you score on your test? And for me, if I have a pot of money today to spend on energy, the most important thing for me to understand is, where do I spend that money, right? Should I spend the money on the building that's the most obvious in terms of occupancy, or should I spend the money on the building that is the worst performing one? It depends on what your big goal is. So the poll results are back. Are you tracking your central utilities? A good 55% folks are saying they are tracking it, which is really good. A couple of them are saying that they want to do it. So we can definitely work with you on it, right? Ultimately, it's the first step in understanding to go net zero or reducing your carbon footprint is to understand where you are. Okay. So what does this exercise provide you? This exercise provides you an understanding of energy use intensity. So how do you compare your barn to your office building, or how do you compare the gymnasium to your research facility? Those are apples and oranges. They're different buildings, different end uses. But at the same time, you can understand what's the energy use intensity, what's the energy being used per square feet of your building, right? And then it gets compared to standards of what should your building be consuming. And then it allows you to rank the buildings, which is based on who's my worst performing to which is my best performing. And Energy Manager actually pushes the data, pulls the data back from Energy Star Portfolio Manager to understand and rank your buildings in a single platform. So this allows you to say, okay, this is my worst performing building. This is where I need to put the most money in so as to reduce my carbon footprint. And this is the whole goal of understanding where you are at today, which is, we believe, is a phase one of an energy project, right?
Hey, Kaustubh, on that, on the last slide, I think that's one of the key takeaways as far as I'm concerned. From a facilities point of view, non-energy professional, Energy Star takes, it might be confusing to you, like I got electric bills over here and I got gas bills over here and I got a couple buildings, back off the grid that operate off propane. How do I compare those? And the answer is, this is exactly how you compare those. And you don't need to know how to do the math at all, because Energy Star does it for you. It puts that all into a combined common denominator and just calls it energy intensity. And you can compare that propane building to your all electric building and still say which one is efficient and which one's not efficient. So to me, that's like the wow thing, and all that. And all you have to do is get utility bills in there, and you can pull these key insights out and say, man, if I just get my buildings up to average, like I could be doing so much better. And so that's the big so what. So if you can just get people to get utility bills as step one and get some insight into it, it's just a huge step forward. So sorry to interrupt. I will silence myself for a minute.
That's all right. So once you have the problem charted, as Matt said, you can compare the buildings and understand your propane building versus electric buildings. This is where we send our field auditors and say that let's do an energy audit on those buildings. So the way we approach energy audit is we look at the 5 fundamental aspects in a building. One, we look at the HVAC system, which is often called as the heart of the building. It keeps the building running, heating, cooling, ventilation, cooling tower, boilers, everything included, right? Distribution system. Then we look at lighting, plumbing, envelope, and controls, right? So HVAC is your seasonal load. Your heating season, it spikes during the fall and the spring, the consumption goes down. But whereas you compare your lighting, plumbing, and those are something as your base load consumption. That's something that more or less is standard all year long. So if you attack your lighting and plumbing, which is, you may have heard this from a million different people till now, that lighting is your base load, that's your biggest bang for buck, right? Which is because your lighting runs almost 12 hours a day. If you can save on it, you save big time, right? HVAC has a longer payback, lighting, plumbing has a smaller payback. So altogether, right, when you look at an energy audit that we put together for you, it's going to address all 5 aspects of it so that you can get a holistic viewpoint of all the opportunities you have in the building so as to reduce your energy use at the building, right? And whatever be your end goal, you may want to reduce your carbon emissions, you want to do your cost savings, you want to meet a certain goal. At the end of the day, you want to see all the different savings we come up with, right? And most important thing is understanding how the savings get calculated. So once our guys come back from the field, after collecting information, we start crunching our numbers through in-house developed calculators that we have been developing over the last 11 to 12 years, where all the inputs come in. We publish those calculators in the appendix of the report that allows the client to look at it and understand and follow it logically to say, okay, this is how the savings have been generated, right? We also use some of the DoD generated calculators for PV watts, for solar generation, so that our analysis is in line with the industry standard that's being used. Ultimately, once all these calculations are done, we synchronize it and put it together in a simple to understand ECM table, right? So the table provides you what your measure is, where it's applicable, what's your initial investment, what's your savings by fuel type, right? So this is kind of critical for net zero to understand savings by fuel type. Then we provide you one of the key factors like total greenhouse gas savings by each measure. So if your goal is to say, I want to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions by such a percentage, you can start picking off items which have the highest bang for the buck, right? Which are the items that will provide me the biggest greenhouse gas reductions? You can choose those ones. And we provide you the simple payback. And most important, what we provide you is the savings to investment ratio. So savings to investment ratio, which is highlighted over here, is also called as profitability index, which means that if I invest $1 today into a measure, will I make my money back within the life of its improvement? So if you look at the first measure, it has a life of 15 years. Okay, that's the expected useful life of those controls that we are recommending to be installed. So if I install that, would I recover the money back within the life of that measure, taking inflation into consideration, which we consider around 3%. And if that ratio comes back as greater than 1, then it's a go. That means it's financially feasible. Again, we provide both options over here so that if you are a net zero client who doesn't want to like focus on payback, but wants to focus on the greenhouse gas emission reduction, then you can look at what's your metric tons of savings. But if you want to go for like cost savings, then you might want to focus on the SIR so that you can say that out of the bucket of money available for energy improvements, I'm going to choose the first 4. And the last measure, I'm going to add it to my capital improvements so that you can prioritize which measures you can use when, right? So once you have those investments, right, the question comes is like, where does the money come from? That's a big question. And one of the key things is tapping into, are there any incentives? Are there any rebates? Is there any federal incentive? Is there any state money? Is there incentive from the utility companies? So a lot of clients go to this website called Desire, DSIRE, which has been around for almost a decade now, very popular in understanding where the utility savings, not utility incentives come from. So one of the key things that we do over here is the ECM table that I just showed, right? We push this information into the energy manager software. The goal is you want to have a single platform where you have your energy consumption, your benchmarking, your potential energy measures, and the platform also links your potential incentives to your measures. This allows you to say, okay, I have around $65,000 of lighting improvements. Where can I go to figure out what incentives are available? So you can click on the link and say, this is the state I am in, this is my utility provider, these are the incentives I have, which I can tap into. So that allows you to understand what is going to be my net initial investment, right? Not net would be minus the rebates and incentives. So this is where the whole tabulation comes into play. And as we enter the phase 3 is understanding how to prioritize. Dan is going to talk more about it, that how do you move those ECMs around? Dan, you want to take over from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Now that we're kind of painting the picture of, phase 1, taking the snapshot of where our portfolio is today, most inefficient, most inefficient. Now that we've gotten, BV&A on site to perform an audit of those, facilities and understand what measures we can do, like Costa was saying, those measures are loaded into the software. So now you're getting a more full picture of how software and services play a role. And not to beat a dead horse, but when we talk about how to prioritize projects, this is where setting goals as an organization is critical. We've got to know what we are working towards. Our goals could be, public relations related. I want to make sure that I take care of that pretty shiny, fancy building because the public's in and out of it, and we want to make sure it's operating efficiently and smoothly. So any measures that we implement, they may go towards that building, even if it's not, the highest cost saving measure. Right? Goals may be, quickest to some type of carbon reduction goal, or goals may be, prioritized based on a certain commodity, water or gas or electricity, whatever it may be. And so when we talk about the power of software, it really is that one-stop shop to help us sort, run filters, run reports on, show me projects that have, a savings to investment ratio of X, or show me projects that have a, simple payback of Y, whatever those goals may be. And Energy Manager helps you do that. But it's not just prioritizing which projects are done. If we look on the next slide, there's really a key component. Once we've implemented a measure, what were the results? And I see so many organizations lose steam right here. We've done all the work to identify opportunity. We've done all the work to get projects funded, and then we just assume it was a success. Well, maybe, right? But how much of a success? Enough that I should duplicate it at other sites? Or maybe it's not showing us the payback that we thought. Maybe weather has played a role. So our payback is going to extend a little bit. There are all these variables. And when organizations fail to continue tracking and performing measurement and verification, we really lose a lot of momentum. And so that's where, when we start looking at, weather normalization or year-over-year reporting, that's where software really can step in and do that, certified measurement and verification protocol on your behalf. So I think we've got, this is where we're really going to talk a little bit more about some of the sustainability side when we talk about net zero cost. So I think we're coming back to you, or
Yeah, that's right. So let's talk about net zero. Some of you guys mentioned that you have net zero goals, right? And we did talk about this earlier. What exactly is net zero? Net zero is somewhat a loosely defined goal where everyone has its own way of interpreting it. If you look at the textbook definition of net zero, which means that if you emit, let's say, 10,000 metric tons of CO2, you may want to reabsorb 10,000 metric tons of CO2 back so that your impact is zero, right? That's the true meaning. But a lot of clients interpret it as saying that, how about me minimizing my impact to almost zero carbon emissions? So when this is open for interpretation, right? Further, there are scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So a lot of clients say that I'm going to primarily focus on bringing my scope 1 and scope 2 emissions to zero, which means emissions by procuring utility from the grid, emissions from my operations of the building, such as my boilers or my rooftop package units, so on and so forth, right? But scope 3 is the vehicular operations and other ancillary utilization. So that's still not been brought into net zero yet for most of the clients. But when we consider building and infrastructure, quite often net zero is related to the first two items mainly related to it. So while we have been working with the clients in the last couple of years on net zero, we came up with our approach of how to go for it, right? Quite often it comes down from the top and says that 2030, we want to be net zero, a bold goal, right? That means it's 8 years and the clock is ticking. So similar approach to how we approach energy audits, right? First thing is we understand where we are at. What's my greenhouse gas emissions? Benchmark your buildings, understand which building is consuming the most energy. Practically, it's going to be really difficult to bring an existing building to zero emissions. Very difficult. Quite often buildings have to be redesigned, rebuilt to bring it to zero emissions. So how do we offset it, right? We first try to optimize the energy and water use at your buildings through non-renewable measures, right? These are the standard energy conservation measures. When we send our assessors out, they go through a list of 52 different measures that are applicable to most commercial buildings. And I check off the items which are applicable, which have been implemented and which are not applicable, right? And that way we try to cover a vast majority of energy measures at each site. Once that is done, we start identifying what are the systems at the site which actually burn fossil fuel. These contribute to scope 2 emissions. So the goal over here is to bring everything to electric. That's the fossil fuel conversion. A lot of cities, like New York City is talking about it, the number of cities in California which are started to say all new constructions have to be all electric, right? There is a big push towards moving away from natural gas because it's until 5 years ago, we all talked about switching over to natural gas, but it soon has become one of the biggest emitter of CO2. So the talk is like, let's go towards electric. And the goal over here is identifying the most energy efficient electric alternatives. So it might be geothermal systems, or it might be high efficiency heat pump based rooftop package units, or it might just be a plain old resistance heat, right?
Hey, Kaustubh,
yeah,
I think that's the big so what on this section. I think is up to this point we've been talking about, and almost everybody on this call is an existing building heavy organization, and they're looking to get efficient. So it starts with what's the max efficiency I can get out of the building that I've got, and that what you're adding on top of the stack here is what if we converted, what. So that's one, and then two, supply side. Where's my energy coming from? Am I using geothermal? Could I put solar? Is it feasible? So these are the kind of things that get added into the stack here as we're starting to what everybody's kind of calling net zero type of approach. So zero may not be possible in the existing building, but this is the kind of stuff that as far as my experience with K-12 schools, county gov, there's often a time that someone will come to the facilities guy at the county gov and say, hey, people are asking about solar. Do we have any buildings where that would make sense? Because we think we've got some buy-in to pull the trigger on funding a solar project. And then we're going to talk a little bit about incentives and stuff. So this is where that all comes together, kind of to the next level.
That's right, Matt.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So ultimately, when you walk away from fossil fuel, right, you're going to go towards all electric fuel. And that's where the solar comes into the play, where you start saying, this is where I'm going to offset my emissions from my electric use. And ultimately, as Matt said, it's very difficult to convert an existing building to net zero. And that's where we tell our clients that this is the remaining energy that you're going to still be consuming from the grid, but we have an option of purchasing green energy to renewable sources. So at that point, we can tap into renewable generator, like windmill, hydro, or solar, or whichever is applicable, right? So that allows you to still meet your net zero criteria, even though your building is not really net zero. So again, it's the way we look at it. And a lot of our clients have accepted this is the method to go forward with, because they do care for the impact that they are leaving behind. But at the same time, it's essential that the way we address it should be cost feasible. Okay. So with this, let's talk more about the federal stimulus funds that's coming down. And Matt is going to talk more about this as we go.
Thanks, Kaustubh. Hey, before I do, was there a question in the chat? Should we answer that now? Someone's asking about in the Q&A about software for energy audits, and of course, DSI. We're here talking about Energy Manager software. So this is what we use in our practice is a homegrown package that's similar to a facility assessment package, where we're looking at the existing equipment. As far as how do we set a client up to get utility bills in, it's the Energy Manager software, and Dan can speak to that. Anything to add, Dan?
Yeah, no, I would say it's along this process, the tracking of utility data, the benchmarking of your buildings, on the back end, in the context of this conversation, is the measurement and verification of those ECMs that we implement, and kind of that's what I would add.
So that's a good one. And Cheyenne, you're monitoring the chat
There's one more
box.
question from Mark. There's one more question from Mark here. Says, how do you account for utility companies that have an energy mix that still include fossil fuels? Building electrification only makes sense if the electric provider is fossil free, which is actually true, right? And so there are states which are still regulated, where you can't purchase energy from your own provider, but most states are providing deregulated options where you can go and source energy from a particular provider. So Texas is one of the largest generator of windmill generating power. So being in Maryland, we can go and purchase electricity from Texas, right? At the end of the day, it's just a paper trail because it all goes to a massive grid. So, but still on paper, you can say that we are purchasing electricity from windmill, which is probably going to be more expensive than the coal-fired or gas-fired. But at the same time, you can get those credits where you're saying, I'm offsetting my energy or my carbon emissions by providing energy from the green source.
So I'll give you a real quick answer to that as well. So it's kind of an apples and oranges thing going on right now. Certainly, it's still cheaper to heat your building using gas, right? But everybody's looking at the political tea leaves and climate change and what's going to get support out of the upcoming infrastructure plan, and it's not going to be fossil fuels. So it wasn't very long ago that Kostov and I were approaching counties that had office buildings built in the 70s and that were all electric, and we're like, you've got gas right out in the street. You need to convert this building and get rid of the electric baseboard heaters because it's terribly inefficient. But that's not the number one driver right now. So that's going to be customer. That's going to be up to each individual to decide, and part of that's going to be not about dollars and cents. It's going to be about where you're going and what the politics are to get that done. So I probably over answered that. So, but good question. Hey, I was going to ask Cheyenne, who's in the background, to type in the address of that DSIRE website. That is a great website that all of you can use. It's the database for state incentives for renewable energy. That's what the DSIRE stands for. And I think it's just dsire.org. And then there's NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. That if your boss comes up and says, what would happen if we put solar panels on top of City Hall, you could do a decent approximation of that using a Google map and the NREL data. Of course, you'd get much more accurate results if you did everything we just showed you and we got to level 3 and started throwing that on top of a whole building and portfolio. But you were asking about available software. Those are 2 free ones that your taxpayer money is funding. So check them out. Does that hit all the questions? It's always more interesting to answer questions than to show slides. Okay, cool. The roof-mounted wind turbines. Any thoughts on that, Kostov?
So it's actually right, and that was one of the reasons of the big issue with Texas. Its grid is isolated. Texas doesn't like to share its power with other people, nor does it like to take power from other states. And so that was one of the big issues when a power failure happened in Texas during the freeze. But at the same time, you can tap into windmill and other generated power from other states as well. We are working with a client in Pennsylvania, and we are working with them for the same thing of how they can reach the net zero goals. And we discovered that buying power which is windmill generated in Pennsylvania from Pennsylvania based windmill generators is more expensive than buying power from other states. Not completely aware of how that thing works or how the funding and tariffs work, but it's sometimes interesting that some of the states offer their power at a cheaper rate than other states. So there are always those brokers who can help you out when you're trying to buy the green power from other states.
Okay, cool. So let's hit this last section, then definitely keep the questions going. So you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so I put this together and I was going to update it with the infrastructure bill, which is still in flux. But then I thought about it and I'm like, okay, I think this bar is telling us what we need to say, which is if you look at the new amount of money the federal government put into the New Deal and the amount of money the government put in during the last financial meltdown, there's a lot of money going around out of the Fed, and a lot of it is for facilities. You want to go to the next slide? So this is an example of, through the first two rounds, what was set aside for education. 130 billion K-12 and 40 billion higher ed. Specifically, this was about reopening schools, and specifically, if you could tie a project to HVAC upgrades, meeting CDC standards, reopening, social distancing, all these things were fundable under this funding. You want to go to the next one? This is a little highlight about Energy Infrastructure Act, about what was needed to get those projects approved. And so we think this is going to be the same bullets are going to apply to the rest of funding that's coming through the infrastructure package. And generally what this is saying is there needs to be an assessment of the need. There needs to be a project described and what savings it's going to deliver. Really, if any of you are working in government facilities during the ARRA funding, that was all tied to demonstrating paybacks. Projects wouldn't get funding if they weren't defined, met the standards, and had a measurable payback using a standard way of benchmarking the payback. So everything we've talked to you about today would deliver the plan that's required, the potential savings and ability to track those and benchmark, and what we're calling measurement and verification. If you get your utility bills set up now and then track them afterwards, you can show that those savings were delivered. So that meets all the things that are required to tee up and then M&V a project afterwards. So we think this is a recipe that's going to be required as this money is coming down. Now, all the money is not being spent this year. It's being spent over a couple periods. You want to go to the next slide? So I really just included this slide because I think it's one of the best pie charts I've ever seen. And it's also really confusing, which is kind of where we are with the infrastructure package. It hasn't been passed yet. There's lots and lots of pieces. But if you look at the pie wedge on the left side, that's another 400 billion going to schools. You look at the next biggest pie wedge, which is the one around 330 down to 530. That's all energy and power with a little bit of broadband thrown in there. So that's the stuff that we're talking about here. Oh, and raise your hand if you're a facilities guy and anybody has asked you when you're going to put in your electrical vehicle charging station. Probably every single one of you. So we're talking to lots of county gov guys. We're talking to, they're being asked, shouldn't the libraries have EV chargers in them? So not exactly what we're talking about today with an energy audit, but look at the 130 down there to 330 in the pie. EV infrastructure is big, and it's going to be built out with a lot of that with state and local entities leading the way. So, talk to us at the next time that we talk about what we're doing with EV charges. It all ties into the same kind of story. What's the next slide? Oh, that's it. So it looks like we had a couple other questions. Do you want to tee up the, so little closing slide. This is a little bit about best practice. What do you need to do to get started? And really what we think you need to do to get started around energy is to just start. A lot of my slideshows talk about where are we now, where are we going, how do we get there? The where are we now is getting all your utility bills in one place and getting them organized, and then comparing them to others. That starts to inform the where are we going. What would happen if we brought these buildings up to standard, up to average, and then everything that Kastu talked about, where all the different things that we can do to get you there. Looks like we got.
Yeah.
Hey Dan, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to tie a bow on it. For those of you on the call, go check out my LinkedIn. I actually shared a post this morning. The end result of taking the time to implement an energy plan, sustainability plan, whatever, has meaningful impact to your peers and your community. And what I mean is, Des Moines Public Schools. We shared a great story this morning. Even aside from the incredible financial opportunity with this infrastructure bill that we've got, even aside from that, they were able to hire 15 and fully fund 15 teacher positions, 100% from energy savings initiatives. So when we talk about the opportunity, the impact of this, I love to just simply say energy management is a revenue source. And so I'd love for y'all to check out that story just to kind of put a bow on everything that we talked about today in terms of why should you invest, because you can bring more people on board and fund those things that you've always wanted to fund.
That's really good. So Noel has a question, Matt, and kind of a comment and a question saying that he has often seen windmills in Australia, rooftop mounted windmills, wind turbines, not very popular in US, right? And he's also seen that solar is popular only through solar PV over here, but not through other means, whereas in European countries, it's quite more prevalent as such. And he's right about it, where there was recently a research done by Berkeley Labs, where they said almost 1.4 gigawatts of solar generation and battery storage is in pipeline in US. And one of the reasons for that is the infrastructure doesn't exist yet. So one of the key challenges they're facing is when you have distributed generation, such as everyone putting solar panels on their roof or generating their own electricity on the roof, what's happening is that you are generating your power to run your house or run your facility, but you still need to be connected to the grid because the initial amperage that you require to start your household domestic appliances or any systems in your buildings, the initial voltage, right? That has to come from the grid, like to overcome the inertia. But at the same time, you're not tapping into the service. So what's happening is until now, a lot of your utility bills consist of two parts. One is a distribution charge and one is a generation charge. So you're saying, I don't need a generation anymore, but I still need a distribution. So eventually, what's happening is the people who are having solar and generating their own power, they're saying we don't need as much energy, which is good. But the people who are not generating are still consuming the same amount of energy. So the revenue is slowly going down for power generating facilities. And at the same time, the grid is getting older. So the infrastructure cost is going up. And so you will see that in states like Arizona and other places, there is a hold on solar projects. Same thing. In Hawaii, for example, right? You can't really go and start installing solar because it's such a sun-rich place that if everyone starts putting solar, then the utility company doesn't have enough money to maintain the grid. And one of the key challenges of having solar farms or distributed farms everywhere is it requires a lot of land. And most of the land is in rural America. So these were the old grazing pastures which have been converted to solar farms. But the electrical lines going to those farmlands weren't big enough to bring back megawatts of energy because the farmer never consumed so much energy, right? So the challenge over there was to see how you can maximize the utilization of the grid. If you generate so much power in the rural part of America, how you can bring it back to the main grid. And that's one of the reasons it's slow, right? It's really slow, but ultimately we all can take steps so as to speed up the process.
Yeah, good, good, Kaustubh. So I think there was a couple comments in the chat, but I think we've hit all the questions there. So we're this is focused really on existing building owners, heavy on muni and state and local with a few institutional owners, I think, on the line. So yeah, lots of changes coming, lots of questions about where's the electric coming from, and all stuff that we're all reading about every day and isn't by any means settled. But I think it's clear that the funding is coming, and it's not coming for fossil fuels. So the folks that are making a bet are making a safe bet on building out the electric infrastructure for things like EV. So yeah, so I think we can probably wrap if there's no other questions. Dan, was there anything that you wanted to say in closing?
No, I think today's been good. I hope we've kind of walked us through a pretty intuitive flow, that phase 1, 2, 3 of where are we at today, where can we act, and then how do we prioritize that action. That's how I would summarize bullet points today.
Great. So so you got 3 websites to hit: the DSIRE, the NREL, and Dan's LinkedIn page for for your homework tonight. Kaustubh, anything final thoughts?
Well, I think we covered a lot of points. The goal is to see how everyone can take the right step forward, right?
Great. And there was a couple things in the chat about where the number 1 was this recorded, number 2 the deck. Yeah, I don't know if Kristen's on the line and wants to answer that question, but I think the answer is that it'll be available to everybody who attended, and we'll get an email out to where a link to it is available.
Yes, that's correct. Everyone who attended the webinar today will get a copy of the recorded presentation.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everybody. Now, Kristen, anything else we need to hit?
No, that's it. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for attending. Appreciate it, and have a good afternoon.
Have a great rest of the week, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.